Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to talk briefly about legal contracts and show you the basics of what you need to know when you are considering legal contracts. And there's a few terms that we want to make sure that you understand and some simple definitions. Start with the definition of a contract. So a contract is an agreement between two or more parties that creates some sort of an obligation. Now, by obligation, we mean an offer or a request to do something, and then an acceptance of that offer. Some other terms that you need to know that are part of a legally enforceable contract include the fact that that offer is supported by consideration, meaning something of value is exchanged. It's made by people or parties with the capacity to contract. So that means that they're making their decisions of their own free will, not under duress, that they're of legal age, of sound mind and body to be part of a contract. We also, when we're enforcing a contract or we are creating a legal enforceable contract, we do need to make sure that the purpose is legal and that the contract is in writing or express when it's required to be so. And we'll go over those terms like express, implied, and implied here shortly. Void, voidable, and valid, void and voidable, executed and executory, unilateral and bilateral. So starting with express and implied, there's also a term called quasi, which we're not going to go into, but an express contract is a contract that is expressly understood, it's clear cut, it's in writing. Certain contracts must be in writing in order to be enforceable, and all contracts should be in writing. But just because they are in writing does not necessarily mean that they need to be written in a standard business contract in order to be an express contract. So if somebody were to text you and say, please make me a sandwich, and you were to text back and say, okay, sounds good, I'll make you that sandwich for $10, that's a contract, and that's an express enforceable contract. An implied contract, however, also can be enforceable depending on the nature of what you are trying to enforce. And an implied contract just means that it's not expressly written out, that it is implied. And the terms are not clearly stated, but they're determined based on the circumstances, the surrounding circumstances, or based on an established pattern of dealing. So maybe you didn't text somebody, or somebody didn't text you and say, can you make me a sandwich for $10? But they asked you, hey, can you make me a sandwich for $10? And you said, yes, I can make you that sandwich. Well, that's a contract, an implied contract. And they then need to give you the $10. So there are many circumstances in business where a contract can very clearly be an implied contract and still be an enforceable, valid contract. So a valid contract is one that's legally binding and enforceable, meaning we can enforce the terms of that contract. Now, a voidable contract is a contract that could be enforceable, but it could be canceled. It could be canceled because one part of that contract maybe isn't right. And so the party, one of the parties could choose to cancel the contract. An example of this might be is if somebody contracted you to provide 30 sandwiches and you said, great, I'll go ahead and make 30 salads because you didn't hear quite right. And then you come to the catering and say, I have 30 salads. Well, that's a voidable contract. The person can then say, whoa, no, I wanted 30 sandwiches. I'm not going to pay. And they would be well within their right to do so. So that would be an example of a contract that would be legally voidable. A void contract is one that it's a contract that cannot be enforced. It doesn't have a legal effect. If you got into a contract with somebody who was, let's say, for example, 15 years old, who offered to pay for services, well, they're not old enough to enter into a legal contract, and so that's a voidable contract. If somebody asked you to do something illegal, that's a void contract because legal contracts need to be legal, right? Executed versus executory. So an executed contract is one that all parties have fully performed as stated in the contract, and so it's then executed. An executory contract is one in which it's a legal contract, but one part of the performance has not yet been delivered. So an example might be something like a promise to pay for services, and the service has not yet been rendered. And so it's still an executory contract. It's still legal. It just isn't fully executed because you have not done all parts that need to be done in order to execute that contract. And another term that's related to this that people should understand is unilateral versus bilateral. So a unilateral contract is a contract in which one of the parties may be obligated to fulfill a contractual promise then and only if another party also performs. Now, a bilateral contract is one that obligates everyone to perform according to their promises. So an example of a bilateral would be a promise to pay someone in exchange for a promise to make a sandwich, right? A unilateral contract would be a promise to pay in exchange for making that sandwich. No promise to make that sandwich, right? Is that kind of, hopefully that's somewhat clear. It's the promise for a promise or just the promise for the service itself, right? Another few contractual terms that you need to know, an offer. So an offer is a proposal or a bargain or an exchange to another party or parties. The person who is making the offer is termed the offeror. The person to whom the offer is made is the offeree. The promiser is the maker of a promise. The promisee is the person to whom the promise is made. The obligator is the person who must fulfill an obligation, while the obligatee is the person who the obligator is obligated. That's a mouthful of marbles, right? It's just important, though, to understand who is whom in a contract when you are speaking about contract law. Now, I will say this. In the business, you do have a lot of contracts that you are obligated to create and to use. They're just not necessarily the contract that people have in their minds when they're thinking of a legal business contract. It's typically not written out where these terms that you see in this lecture are included. It's typically a much more informal and much more implied type of contracts are in effect. However, there are some times when you do have some pretty standard legal contracts that you need to fulfill, and a lot of them are service agreements. So a standard service agreement, this is a legal contract between the client and the service provider. Typically, the person providing the services are the service providers, and the agreement outlines important details about this arrangement, about the relationship, the duties that are owed to one another, including duties for payment, duties for services rendered, what they look like, when they're performed, when they're due, etc. And they typically include a lot of information about timing, pricing, ownership, payment details, so much more, shipment if it's included. And I've included here a copy of service agreement. It's a template that we use for our preferred vendors at the educational institution at the San Diego Community College District. Service contracts in general, they're agreements between the person providing the meals or their food and the clients. For example, catering provided to public institutions, schools, private individuals, other organizations. I, for years, provided baked goods under the Trader Joe's brand label, and we had a contract with that overarching organization, and we were providing the food to them. So there are a lot of these contracts. We often call these vendor agreements, preferred provider, preferred vendor agreements. It could be any of the vendors that you're working with or suppliers that you're working with, all the way down the supply chain. So a lot of different contracts that you'll be using. Here's an example of purchase agreement, very simple. These types of agreements should be in writing. Anytime you are talking about money in excess of $100, it should be in writing. There are a lot of resources that we're including here for you, and you can take a look at them as you need and as you like. Some great resources here. And then the next actual section that we're going to be going to, we will be creating a document together. We're actually going to be creating our business plan together, a business one sheet based on a sample business owner. And so we'll go ahead and do that now. But this ends the lecture portion of your first section. Congratulations.